zoom lens or prime lens. Today, we're going to talk about which one you need and what situations you would need it for. So, let's go ahead and dive into today's episode. Alright, so zoom lens or prime lens, let's go ahead and take a look at which one you actually need for the job so you can get ready to go. Alright, so before we go too far into the content, I gotta give the quick disclaimer. A zoom lens or prime lens, these are both fantastic options. All right. This is not going to be me telling you which one you should get because I have a preference. Honestly, they're tools, and based off of the job that you are trying to accomplish, you're going to use the tools that you need, right? It's like a hammer and a screwdriver. Neither one is less valuable than the other. It just depends on the circumstance in which you need it. That's why we're going to talk about zoom lens or prime lens. I think that there's a lot of confusion in the community that one is better than the other, and there are definitely pros to each and there are cons to each. Now, I would like to know what cons and pros you find in either one of these. So if you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and drop it in the comment section below. If you are listening to the podcast, you can shoot me an email and, check the show notes. Shoot me an email. Let me know what you think. But I also want to mention there are some examples, photo examples in today's podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, you're going to see them come up on the screen. If you want to see the photo examples over on, if you check the show notes, there's going to be a link. You can click that. You'll be able to see exactly what I'm showing on the podcast by looking at the photos through that link. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into this. So, the right lens for the job. This is so important. You have to choose the right tool for the job. You've always had to choose the right tool for the job. So, select your lens based on the environment or the limitations that you have. Case in point, if you're going to a concert and you know that you can't really move around so much, depending on how close you are to the stage or to the action, to the artist, whatever, you're probably going to need something that gives you a little bit of reach. Now, depending on if you want to get a variety of shots, wide, tight, medium, without having to change the lens because concerts are probably fast-paced. I've been to them. I've never had to photograph them, but there's a lot of changes that happen throughout the concert. So you may want a zoom lens for that circumstance. However, when you're doing portraits and you're outdoors or whatever, you can move around your subject, maybe a prime lens will work out the best because you're not focusing on having to zoom or, and you're also not being stuck in one area. So choose your lens based off of the environment that you're in and the limitations that you have. If you can move around freely, then maybe a prime lens is a good choice. If you can't move around freely, then maybe a zoom lens is a good choice, just because that gives you the variety that you may miss out on because you wouldn't be able to move around. Now, here's what I will tell you. Prime lens are usually, and this is like a really big asterisk usually, right? More sharp than a zoom lens. And this is just because there's a single piece of glass. All right. With a zoom lens, there's more pieces of glass involved because it has to be able to zoom in to magnify and zoom out. So, there's going to be a little bit less sharpness, but that is really, really dependent on, one, the maker of the lens, what quality of lens it was. There's a lot of things that play into it. Moral of the story, most lenses today are going to be sharp enough for taking good photos, and a whole nother episode on sharpness in general, because I think we are hypersensitive about what sharp is, and I have a lot of photos that I've taken that are not sharp. They're in focus, right? I don't want to get the confusion of sharpness versus focus, right? But I have photos that are focused, but they're not very sharp. And those photos are still great, all right, for lots of different reasons that we're not going to talk about. Moral of the story, the prime lens is usually more sharp than a zoom lens. If that's something you've experienced, let me know in the comment section below. Now, the pros and cons of each lens. All right. If you're watching this on YouTube, you're going to be able to see the slide with all of these listed out. I'm going to read through them. A zoom lens, the pros. You can zoom in on subjects if you're far away. I think we all understand that. I'm not going to go into that. But what we may not understand, or what some of the listeners or viewers may not understand, is a zoom lens, it provides what's known as compression. All right. Compression, in a nutshell, very, very elementary understanding of compression, is it takes the background and separates it from the foreground a little bit more as you zoom in with a zoom lens. Now, if you are using a zoom lens, say in a studio setting, this is probably going to give you the most variety. You can put the camera on a tripod, zoom in and out, take your photos, and then, move on to the next one. Right? That's, again, choosing the tool for the job. Not to say that you can't do the same thing with a prime lens. The downside with using a prime lens is you actually have to move forwards and backwards in order to get those different crops. Now, here's some of the cons of the zoom lens. It often has a variable aperture. So if you're new to photography and you're like, Chris, what are you talking about, variable aperture? You'll see in the examples that I have later on, and I'll point that out a little bit more. But what this means is the lens, as you zoom in, maybe it starts at f2.8 on the widest zoom of that lens. So I actually have a Tamron 35 to 150. On the shortest end of that lens, at the 35 millimeter point, it is a aperture of f2.8. Once I get around 60 millimeters, and I could be throwing this off, I would have to look at that. But moral of the story, as I start to zoom out, my aperture jumps from 2.8 and it maxes out at f4. All right. So 2.8 at 35 millimeters. And then at some point when I zoom in to whatever that range is, then it becomes an f4 aperture as the lowest aperture that I could set. All right. This is common for many zoom lens that are consumer grade, if you will. Now, there are professional zoom lens that stay at a variable aperture, at a fixed aperture of f2.8, no matter how you zoom. Now, my 24 to 70, which is a zoom lens, that's a 2.8. And it stays at 2.8 from 24 millimeters all the way up to 70. And then I also have a 70 to 200, 2.8. And that, again, stays at 2.8 from 70 all the way out to 200. But I just got a new lens that is a zoom lens. And that one is a 150 to 600. I think that's what it is. And that goes from f4 to 6.3. I think that's what it is. I would have to look at that. Moral of the story, as I zoom out or zoom in, the aperture gets a little bit smaller, or I lose light, essentially. Okay. Now, the next con is zoom lens can be pretty expensive. All right. That just depends on what type of zoom lens you're getting. If you're getting like a 18 to 55, that's probably not going to be very expensive. You will run into the variable aperture issue. And, typically an 18 to 55 is usually not the most sharp lens. But again, that's not a big deal. Most zoom lenses are fairly expensive, especially if you want a zoom lens with that fixed aperture of f2.8 or anything like it. And the last con that I have is they're usually heavier than a prime. Now, if you are a Canon shooter, you can get a zoom lens that is probably just a little bit less weight than some of the more, the Canon RF glass, like the 50 millimeter or the 85 millimeter. Those are just like behemoths of lens. And you can manage it, don't get me wrong. And they're beautiful, beautiful lenses, right? But moral of the story, they're heavy. Now, a zoom lens is typically more heavy than those. So just keep that in mind, because one of the pros that I have on the prime lens is that they're usually lighter. And the reason why I say that they are usually lighter or less heavy is because it's only one piece of glass and it fixes onto the lens or to your camera body. Now, those are all the pros and cons for the zoom lens. Moving on to the prime lens, usually it is lighter, as I already mentioned, just because it's one piece of glass and they're usually pretty small, right? It also usually has a faster aperture. Most prime lens, they are like 1.8 or f2, something along those lines, right? There's very few prime lens that are not in that f 1.8 to f4 range. Now, depending on what type of prime lens you're going for, you can have a 400 millimeter or 600 millimeter prime lens, and like Canon has the the Canon 800 millimeter and the Canon 600 millimeter f11. Now, those are very intentional lenses. They're consumer level lenses, right? They're less than $1,000. Either one of them, if you were to buy one at a time, they're less than $1,000 US. So, but the aperture is f11, right? And believe it or not, those are some pretty good lenses. Just you have to make sure you have a lot of light, and you may have to crank your ISO a little bit. But most of the newer Canon cameras, or the Canon cameras that are taking that glass, they do a good job. But that's enough on that. All right. They can also be a little bit more sharp than zoom lens. We already talked on that. Moral of the story, one piece of glass doesn't have a whole lot of things to focus through. Probably going to be a little bit more sharp just because it can nail the focus based off of your auto-focusing system in the camera, and then whatever type of motors are available on the lens, right? So, just take that for what it's worth. That is, I really don't know of too many lenses that just are not sharp. So if you know any, drop it in the comment section below, and we could talk about that. But most camera lenses today are fairly sharp, and I think they work out. And then prime lens, they're usually less expensive. I did mention the Canon 800 and the 600 f11s for the RF, but in every make of camera lens, there's typically a prime lens that's less expensive, unless you're getting into like these art lenses, right? If you go to the Sigma Art series, you can get one for like maybe $800. I think there's a 35 millimeter that's $800, but and compared to some of the other lenses, and or the zoom lenses, $800 may not be too big of a deal, right? But you can get a 50 millimeter 1.8, at least from Canon, the old version, the EF version, for $100. Like in photography dollar points or prices, that's actually fairly reasonable, extremely reasonable. And then Nikon has a 50 millimeter 1.8G lens that you can probably find used about $150, just depends. Moral of the story, they're usually less expensive to get a prime lens, with the exception of some of that pro grade glass where it's like f1.2 and 1.4. Then you're going to be in the thousands, but that's because you're paying for a premium lens, which could be worth it for you. Now, here's the con. Again, you have to zoom with your legs, so you can't just stay in one place. But looking at it on paper, at least with what I brought to you, it sounds like the prime lens is the best way to go because it just works the best, and there's less cons. And that could be true if the job that you are trying to accomplish, the prime lens fits. Like, the prime lens goes out of the window if you instantly cannot move with your legs, right? If you are stuck in one area and the only way that you can get closer to your subject or work on composition with framing and stuff like that is to zoom in, then you automatically have to shift to a zoom lens. But there are other reasons, like if you need to separate, like for headshots, you need compression. Yes, there are some zoom lenses, some prime lens that allow for some pretty good compression, but the best, or I won't say the best, the most commonly used lens for headshots is a 70 to 200. The reason for that is because at 200 millimeters, it compresses the background so well that there's almost no rival. Now, some people will say, oh, well, no, an 85 millimeter will do the same thing, and maybe it will. But again, and the 85 millimeter prime, that's what I'm talking about. But all I'm trying to get across to you is there are some options. All right, that's all. Now, we're going to get into the zoom lens examples. As I mentioned before, I do own the Tamron 35 millimeter to 150 f2.8 to f4.0. And at 101 millimeters, this photo on the left, example number 1, is my youngest daughter playing in the snow, and I stayed in one area. Now, as I was going through all these images, I was like, I'm going to put up a series of photos so that way I can show you that I stayed in one place to make all of these images. But at this particular moment, I'm at 101 millimeters. All right. Now, I could have zoomed that out to 35 and I could have captured more of the area and told the story, but I didn't want to do that, right? I wanted to be able to zoom in and just really isolate my daughter, because if you caught my last episode, you would have heard me say that photography is really about the things you take out of the image or that you just don't include in the frame. There's a lot of stuff I'm not including in the frame. That is the beauty of a zoom lens. A zoom lens could be a really cool tool for creating landscapes and just honing in on a certain part of a landscape, right? And really directing the viewer's attention. I think zoom lens, depending on what type of subject you have, it really does help tell the story a little bit better, because you can really hone in on the thing and say, hey, viewer, I want you to look at this. A zoom lens does a great job at giving you that capability. And that's exactly what I did here, right? Framing at the bottom with the little snow mound that she was making. And then you look up, you can see her hands and there's an action. She's trying to pat the snow or something of that sort. And then you look up, you can see she's not looking at the camera. This is one of those candid moments where she's actually doing something. And you can just like travel through the image, and that I am helping make sure that you see what it is that I wanted you to see. Now, the second image is shot with my Tamron 24 to 70 f2.8. This is, I wanted to show the contrast that there's no variable aperture. All right. This is just an f2.8. This is what you're looking for if you want one of those variable apertures. I have a lot of Tamron lens. I like the lens. I'm not sponsored by them, not affiliated with them. So just put that disclaimer out there. I just really enjoy Tamron. But Tamron, if you're listening, shout out. Come talk to your boy. All right. Here I'm shooting at 60 millimeters, and 60 millimeters is not necessarily wide. It's kind of getting into the telephoto range, but what it allowed me to do is I'm leading you into my daughter with all of the stuff that's sitting on the table, right? You can get an idea of what she's doing. Now, This was a storytelling photo for our family, to share the story with you. This is our daughter's 9th birthday. She was baking her own cake, and she wanted to make her own cake. And this is the first time that she actually got to decorate and do all this cool stuff. So I wanted to include all of the things that are surrounding her in the moment, and then get her focus, right? This is a portrait of her focusing on making this cake, and I can really tell the story. This is actually one of my favorite photos. Now, the zoom lens helped me compose this photo. I could have moved around, but the stuff that is going on, like this exact moment, it actually happened a lot faster. It looks like I slowed it down, stopped it in time, but it was happening a lot faster. By the time I moved forward with my feet, I could have lost the composition, right? So instead, I just twisted the zoom ring up to 60 millimeters, and I was able to get this. Now, was I actually looking to see like, hey, where am I at? Am I at 60 millimeters? Am I at 61 millimeters or 101 millimeters? No, I'm looking through the viewfinder, and I'm actually composing my shot, right? I'm able to compose my shot without having to move myself. This is one of the benefits for me to having a prime lens. And I was able to get this image. Our family, we really love this image, and I love this image. All right. Let me know what you think about this image in the comment section. And if you're on the podcast, listen to this audio only, you can always comment on the blog where all of these files are. So when you get a chance, check that out. Now we're going to move into some prime lens examples. All right. Prime lens examples. The first photo on the left is from our photo walk a little while ago, or last year now. Our family went on a photo walk. I was, just trying to share photography with my kids and my wife, and I used my Canon RF 35mm f1.8. This was really just a lens that I wanted to use. It was a prime lens, and I wanted to use it to see how much I can create and what stories I could tell. Now, the photo on the left is of a man's dog. He was walking. The dog's name is Roscoe. And it's actually amazing that I still remember the dog's name, because this story happened a while ago, but that's the beauty of like photos on a completely separate side note. Moral of the story, I wanted to get a photo of Roscoe, and I had to move in to actually get this photo. Roscoe didn't want to look at the camera. He just wanted to do whatever it is that he was doing, and whatever he's sniffing there. I took the photo of him, and I didn't do much more, right? But the composition, I remember I got down on my knee because I wanted to get on the level of the dog, and I had crawled on my knees just so I can get the composition that I wanted. It was uncomfortable. I'm not going to lie. I'm a pretty big dude, and crawling on my knees trying to get a photo, I was already committed to get the photo. I looked silly, I'm sure, but I got the photo. I liked the photo, and there it is. But that is something that you have to keep in mind with a prime lens. You actually, if you want to get the composition, you have to physically move the camera. All right. Case in point, the photo on the right. This is a photo of very obviously the tree that's front and center, essentially. The problem with this photo is there's a lot of other stuff included in here, right? I was pretty far away from this tree, and I wanted to take a photo of just the leaves and, kind of get the fall color, again, as the seasons were changing. And I intentionally left a lot of the sky in there because I thought that helped give the mood for the day, the time of day, how it was, just how the whole day was going. If I wanted to make this tree bigger in the frame, the only way that I could do it is to walk closer to it. And that's the reason why I am saying I recommend, if you can't move, or moving isn't a thing, you definitely want to think about getting a zoom lens. All right. Prime lens are great because a prime lens will force you to be a little bit more creative with getting your shots. But, and mind you, this prime lens was a 35 millimeter. It's fairly wide. Had I been using an 85 millimeter, it probably would not have been as hard to get the tree in the frame, or to fill the frame from the distance that I was. The tree would have been a little bit larger in the frame, but because I was on the 35, I got what I got. Now, which lens is right for you? Hopefully throughout this conversation, this episode, you started to get the idea of a zoom lens versus the prime lens, and maybe which one you should get for yourself. I can't answer that question for you as like the universal, this is what you want. What I will offer to you is, if you find yourself constantly trying to get closer to your subject, then maybe a zoom lens is a great place to start. The reason why I say this is you may not always be able to get closer to your subject. In fact, I was watching a video on YouTube about Canon, the new, or maybe it was Nikon. Yeah, it was Nikon, the new Z9. And one of the photographers, he was sitting in a mud pile, or puddle, not pile, a mud puddle. And a dirt biker came by, and as he was taking photos, mud was literally splashing on this photographer. And he said, if you want to get great photos, you got to get closer to the action. And that really resonated with me. And so if you are using a zoom lens, you can get closer to the action and hopefully not get mud on you. If you're using a prime lens, you're going to sit there and, to get closer to the action, you're going to have to get mud on you. So there could be a level of comfort, but that just brings the onus back. Now, I will say that a prime lens, at least the 1.8 models in most cases, are a little bit more affordable for a good priced and like a good quality lens. So if budget or if funding is the challenge for you, then maybe a prime lens will be better. I don't know. But here's what I can tell you. You don't need to choose zoom or a prime for the sake of one is better than the other, right? Because hopefully if there's anything that I was able to share through this episode, is neither one is better than the other. It's just, what do you need to accomplish and which one do you want to accomplish? All right. Or which one do you want to use to accomplish that? Both lens, their intention is to take photos, and both types of lens, the archetypes, are really, really good, and they work for what they do. So get a zoom lens if you can't move. Get a prime lens if you can. Okay? That's my recommendation. Get a zoom lens if you can't move. Get a prime lens if you can move around your subject. And then if it comes down to a funding thing, then yes, prime lens are what you want to get. Now, I think that you should have a variety of both if you can afford that. I do also have a recommendation to get a 50 millimeter. If you can only get one lens, all right? If you can only get one lens, like a camera body and one lens, I recommend you get a 50 millimeter. Now, yes, this is going to limit you to getting closer to your subjects, but that's also going to help you get more creative with making your photos. A 50 millimeter, it can do so much. You can do lifestyle photography, you can do product photography, you can do landscape photography. You can do a lot of different types of things, right? You can do portraits, which that's a big one. Moral of the story, a 50 millimeter, if you could only get one lens, that's the one that I would recommend. Hand over fist every single time. That's not because prime lens are better than zoom. That's because the 50 millimeter is so versatile. A 35 millimeter and an 85 millimeter, they kind of lock you into a certain genre of photography. You can absolutely shoot any genre of photography with any lens, either prime, zoom, 35, 85, 400. If you're going to try and shoot product photography with a 400 millimeter lens, you're going to need a really big studio. Just saying. But it could be done, right? I don't recommend it, but it could be done. So hopefully that helped someone make a decision between, if you're at that window of, do I get a zoom lens or do I get a prime lens? You choose which one would work best for you. Now, if you haven't already, go ahead and join the Free Will Photos website. It is completely free to do. There's going to be a link in the show notes, the description box, whatever platform you're listening on, you can do it. You can do it from your mobile. And what's even better is you can sign up using any existing social account that you have. So you can sign up with your Google account. You can sign up with a Facebook account. You can do all that good stuff. And it's completely for free. And there's stuff inside of the members area. I just updated today with all of the free presets for On One Photo Raw. So if that's what you're using, you can absolutely get in there. And then, of course, rate, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to interact with this content on the platform in which you're on. And until the next time, I want you guys to stay inspired and keep creating. Peace.